I want to have Tom Gross, a political analyst and also the former Middle East correspondent for the London Sunday Telegraph, join us. Tom, thank you for joining us.
Morning.
We're of course speaking about the way international media has been covering this past conflict, and of course we have to compare it to previous conflicts. I want to present the same question to you. Do you believe that the coverage has changed since perhaps the 2008 Operation Cast Lead?
It's possible it's changed, and very slightly. I do agree that the Israeli spokespeople are a bit more articulate, a bit better. They have a better command on social media and so on. And also there's a little bit more sympathy for Israel because, after all, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, other major cities are being rocketed.
We're having a bit of a difficulty. Tom?
Sorry. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I said, 1 second, I'm sorry.
Okay. We're going to get your Skype fixed. Do you believe that there is more sympathy? Would you call it sympathy?
Look, I certainly think that there's an understanding in the international community, and it's been expressed by many countries, that Israel has the right to defend itself. One of the idiosyncrasies of covering the story is that because of Israel's Iron Dome system, the casualty count, of course, on this side of the border is so much lower. And as much as I hate talking in terms of numbers, my feeling is that because the numbers in Gaza are so much higher than they are in Israel, and I mean, you know, kudos to the Israelis for coming up with a system like the Iron Dome.
And the women and kids.
But when you're a viewer, wherever you are in the world, and you see the pictures coming out of Gaza, it's inevitably going to rise sympathy because the pictures are more dramatic, because the casualty count on the Gaza side is so much higher than the Israeli side. And that's why my reading of the situation is also that as this conflict continues, you're likely to see potentially media outlets and viewers around the world starting to empathize more and more with the Gaza side, because the story is working, at least picture-wise, which is what so much of particularly television media is about.
Right.
It works against the Israeli argument.
And newspaper, of course, as well. Tom, I want to let you finish your point.
Yes, sorry. I would say that although the situation for Israel and the foreign media might be slightly better than on past occasions, it's still very, very bad. It's not just the content, it's the amount of coverage, it's the sensational way they're covering it, it's the amount of correspondents that have been allocated. For example, the BBC, I'm told, has had more people in Gaza in the last 2 or 3 weeks than they ever had in Iraq at the peak of the 2003 invasion that involved, of course, British troops. Afghanistan is America's longest war in history. It's one of Britain's longest wars. The BBC, which is the world's biggest news broadcaster, has allocated more correspondents to Gaza than they have ever done at any one time to Afghanistan. And inevitably, there's a lot of sensational coverage, there's a lot of blood and gore. This then spills over into things like cartoons. I have, for example, from The Guardian 1 or 2 days ago, here's Netanyahu wearing a Palestinian suicide vest. I don't quite know what the cartoonist means by that. Here, for example, on The Independent, it says the myth of human shields. Well, this is not the myth of Hamas human shields. This is not a news article. This is not a comment article. That was their main news article of the day. And other journalists have said, well, Hamas themselves have pointed out that they may have used human shields, or at least encouraged civilians to remain in likely targets and so on. So there is an inordinate amount of coverage. It's often hysterical. And as a consequence, we see hysterical questions asked in Parliament, for example, in Britain, or demonstrators on the streets and so on. So, of course, journalists should do their job, but I don't know where, as a news value, they think that, you know, 4 of the 7 foreign pages should be dominated by this one topic.
And why would you say that the media is covering it in this certain way as you've described? Is there a reason behind it? Is there a motive behind it?
Well, I'd say there's several motives. I'll start with the most controversial, and I'm very, very reluctant to say this, but I think there is a degree of anti-Semitism, often subconscious, by many people in Europe. It's a kind of getting over our Holocaust guilt phenomena, where if they can portray Israel to be behaving in an almost Nazi-like way, which is why they use terms like concentration camp about Gaza or genocide or so on, it will make them feel better for any lapses other European nations may have in not participating, collaborating, and so on. So I think there's anti-Semitism as an element. Another element is it's just easier, in spite of the airline ban the other day, it's much easier to fly into Ben Gurion Airport than it is into Damascus Airport. They also don't care very much about how can I put it, non-white people killing non-white people, whether in the Middle East or sub-Saharan Africa. It's more news when a Western nation is supposedly responsible for mass slaughter. However, the question is, why do they undercover Afghanistan? France, for example, is continuing to kill in large numbers people in Mali, in the Ivory Coast and in the Central African Republic. Why is this not of interest? I mean, France is a nuclear power like Israel. It's a member of the UN Security Council. It's one of the main countries in Europe. What judgment is there that Gaza is, less deaths in Gaza are considered more newsworthy than more deaths at the hand of the French in the Central African Republic? And I think there's a degree of prejudice. And I say this reluctantly because I don't like to think of colleagues of mine who I've worked with in the British media as being prejudiced. And I'm sure they would be horrified to think of themselves as prejudiced. But that is the conclusion I think one inevitably has to reach. If Israel was not a Jewish state, there would not be such a kind of hysterical reaction to what's happening in Gaza.
Netta, would you say that within the Israeli media there is this more of a spectrum of self-criticism, or perhaps in times of wars we do see most of the news media outlets getting one side of the conflict, not trying to really look at the Gaza side? And here and there we do see some media outlets, ours of course is one of them, as being more of the self-critical piece of information.
I must say it's really scary what's going on in the Israeli media these days. You're really not allowed to say anything that criticizes the war or that mentions the casualties on the other side. And the censorship is not the army, it's not the media itself, it's the public. You're really there is zero tolerance to anything that is...
Has that changed, or was that always something, a factor?
It became really, really extreme in this war. I see, the Israeli news every night, and only at 9, they start at 7 because it's a special edition, and only at 9:30, which is 2 hours and a half afterwards, there is one piece of 4 minutes about what's going on in Gaza, and it's very, very minor to the rest, and, it's only after all the soldiers, the casualties, their story have been told and everything, and only then you can see some footage from Reuters or AFP or, the other. And
why is that? It's hard to put your finger on why the Israeli public has become so maybe united against certain self-criticism, because Israel always prided itself, of course, on the pluralist democracy of media and the many media outlets that it has that was always self-critical of the government and so forth.
Yeah, I think... Israel, the public needs it's not very self-secured. They need this security, and they think that if you will criticize this offensive, then you will maybe harm the morale of the army, or you will. And they think you should totally support the moral army. And there's a thing about the Israeli society, they are striving to be very homogeneous. There isn't very pluralistic thinking, as if, like in the US, for example, people have to be really in one line here. This is from ages now. I think because many people came from all over the world, and they being Jewish is what, put us together.
Right.
So I think this is it. And the society has become really, really right-wing and not able to see the other side. I think the main thing that has to do with it is the occupation. It's really, really hard for the Israeli public to understand that we are occupying, and there is the consequences to that, and that we control the lives of other people. And this is why it's very hard for them to see that. And also Hamas, we have to admit it's a terrible terror organization. They are really bad in all means to their own people and to us. And people tend to see things in black and white. They can't see complex reality. And this offensive is, of course, more complex than just the good people fighting the bad terror organization.
Indeed. I do want to just update our viewers right now. We're getting reports that the IDF, this is according to reports within the Palestinians, that the IDF has struck the house of the spokesperson of the Islamic Jihad. we will be updating you as much as we can once the information gets in. Tom, I do want to let you respond to the question posed here in studio.
Yes, as someone who's lived and worked as a journalist in Israel, the United States, and Great Britain, of course, every country, the population tends to rally round their government and army in a time of war. If I could make a comparison, though, Israel is far more pluralistic, there's far more criticism, and there's far more knowledge than there was, for example, in the British or American press. For example, there have been wedding parties bombed in Afghanistan with about 130 people killed. It got a single line on about page 15 or something of the New York Times. Britain and America have killed thousands of people. I don't want to make a political judgment on the rights and wrongs of any of these wars, including the present conflict with Hamas. I'm simply stating that it's, of course, any country's media is going to be slightly partial to themselves. But I think that sometimes people in Israel, especially on the left, are not aware just how pluralistic Israel is in comparison. Maybe it's not pluralistic enough, but I don't know any other country in the world that has a newspaper like Haaretz, which week after week, year after year, is so self-critical. Journalists like Gidon Levy, Amira Hass, and the like simply would not be media superstars in US, UK, France, and so on. It would be impossible.
Netta, I'll let you respond, and then I do want to get Paula's reaction as well.
Haaretz is under attack for the past 18 days. It's really, when you read the comments at the end of articles, yesterday when I was in Haaretz offices, there was a phone call to the producer there, threatening to kill her, Gidon Levy, and all the rest of you there. We are really we feel under attack. There is no. We feel that the right-wing person who goes crazy can put a bomb there or something, and Gidon Levy is being with a security guy 24 hours. Maybe we're more pluralistic than other countries, but I think we have a long way to go until the ideal pluralism state.
We're just going to get a quick update now from our i24 news correspondent, Merav Seville. Merav, you're on the Israeli-Gaza border this morning. You're standing by there. What's the latest?
Yael, we are here on a hill overlooking the Gaza Strip behind me. If you look over my left shoulder, you can actually see white smoke coming out of what seems to be a tunnel, one of those tunnels that we spoke about earlier leading out of the Gaza Strip. We showed the graphic that some of them do come right underneath the towns across the border from Gaza, where both they hide weapons and militants can come out of. So we've been told that you can actually see these throughout the week, just the white smoke coming out of where the tunnel entrance on the Israel side of the border is.
And Merav, of course, it was a quiet morning up until just a few minutes ago. Of course, code red sirens across the south, including Ashkelon.
Absolutely. At around 7:45, we heard the first siren go off in Ashkelon, the industrial area, and the Ashkelon Coastal Regional Council. It was a fairly quieter morning before that, but residents are saying that they're already getting used to this. We were in Ashdod just a couple days ago. Same thing, at around 8 or 9 in the morning, those sirens began and continued throughout the day.
Merav Seville, our i24 news correspondent there at the Israeli-Gaza border. Thank you for joining us. Paul, I want to bring you into the discussion. Of course, you write, you're the bureau chief here in the Middle East for Russia Today. You do have a commitment to your constituency, quote unquote, your readers and your viewers, but at the same time, you do have a commitment to tell the story on the ground. Is that a very big tension that you have to deal with?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily a big tension, but I certainly say that I understand exactly your comments in terms of where you position yourselves as a newspaper. I think, firstly, the Israel-Gaza story, of course, is not the main story in the Russian press, and it's not the main story for Russia Today, RT, by any stretch of the imagination. In a half-an-hour bulletin, we may be covering this conflict with about 2 minutes. Our focus in the Russian media, of course, is the Malaysian plane, is the situation in Ukraine, and is the situation in Syria. So firstly, media operates in terms of providing to the public what the public is interested in. But there's also that challenge in terms of, do you give the public what they're interested in, or do you give the public and try to persuade them, if you like, in inverted commas, to think in a certain kind of way? And we have a very particular challenge at RT. The Russian media is trying to be as impartial as possible. Most of the Russian media gets its guidelines from the Kremlin and reflects the view of the Kremlin. And the Kremlin on this issue has been pretty objective. They understand and they have strong relationships with Israel, and they have strong relationships that date back to the Soviet time with the Palestinian world.
Putin even offered to be a mediator, right?
Putin offered on Wednesday. He phoned the Israeli Prime Minister and said that if the situation continues to escalate, we'll see a complete deterioration within the region. We'll also see an increase in the number of people who've been killed, and he is willing to mediate, as you say. Russia's position is a two-state solution, but not supporting armed attacks against Israel. The challenge we face in RT is, while trying to reflect this very balanced coverage, we speak to an audience that traditionally is quite anti-West. So we get a lot of criticisms from our viewers in the same way that you do. How can we be giving so much coverage to Israel and it continues to degrade Israel in the most strongest terms? So I think all journalists face, number one, we have to talk to our home public, and number two, we have to talk to our constituencies. And certainly we're not being threatened with our lives because of the Israel-Gaza conflict, but we have been threatened, and I have been threatened because of our coverage in Ukraine. So it's very much what is the story, and then the public feels if you're betraying them, in inverted commas, on that story, that they have a right to kind of push you on that issue.
And I want to put in another factor that perhaps has changed since other operations, and have both of you comment. Social media has become maybe, as taking the place of the traditional media, also newspapers, also TV, even the web editions of both each of your outlets. And sometimes people are getting their information from Facebook posts and stopping it at there. Where can the international media have a place when of course, we're getting WhatsApp messages of what's happening on the ground?
I mean, social media is the most fantastic and the most dangerous thing to have happened. For me, it was covering the Egyptian revolution, as I mentioned earlier, in 2011, where it was almost the Twitter revolution. And we were constantly getting tweets, and you want to be foremost in terms of giving the news, but at the same time, you want to check your sources. We were always trained to check at least two sources, who tended to be Associated Press and Reuters, and only if they reported it did you go with the story. The problem is, because there's so much competition out there today, you want to be first with the news. And what you raise is a huge discussion that happens in journalist circles, is what is a journalist today if everybody can take an Instagram, everybody can tweet, everybody can use their cell phone
and
for photographs.
And
the challenge for us, who are actually professional journalists, I think still maintains checking our sources in terms of social media. But it becomes more and more difficult to authenticate sources. But on the other hand, we get incredible access to footage, particularly footage that we wouldn't have if we didn't have this kind of social media at our access.
Tom, I want to let you also respond. Of course, the increase of social media.
I agree with what you've just said, but there's still journalist prejudices coming into play. I'll give you an example. In Syria, it's been very difficult for journalists to get access. A number who have been kidnapped or killed. However, there's a huge amount of footage coming out by ordinary people taken on their cell phones. But I know, from having spoken to senior executives at the BBC in London, they don't want to use that footage, and they don't want to use it, from what I could tell, for political reasons, not because they don't think it's so authentic or so on. So again, I think they're two separate issues. One is the accuracy and the balance, but the other is balance in between stories. And RT is probably an exception. Obviously, it's interested in the Ukrainian issue more than other issues. But for example, I listened to the BBC World Service Radio earlier this morning. The first 21 minutes of a 30-minute bulletin dealt with Gaza. Afterwards, there was about 30 seconds on the plane crash yesterday, the Algerian plane crash. The point being that more than half the victims were French citizens of that plane crash. The BBC is publicly funded, and it's actually under a legal obligation to be balanced. I don't think they've consulted the public, and that's not just the British public, but their worldwide audience. Do the public want more than 2/3 of their world news broadcast just about Gaza? Is it more important than the fact that in Mosul in Iraq yesterday, ISIS have ordered female genital mutilation on all women? There are no Christians left in Mosul. It's a 2 million people city, so that's bigger than Gaza. More people have been killed in Mosul, and it's probably strategically a bigger threat to the West. ISIS now control about 1/3 of Syrian territory and so on. Remember that the Western taxpayer has put a lot of resources into Iraq in the last 10, 15 years. Where is the judgment that the ordinary person in London should be interested 1,000 times more in Gaza than it is in Iraq? I mean, I think it's a prejudice of the BBC and other media in deciding that.
Tom Gross, thank you for joining us there in London. Paula, I want to thank you also for coming in studio, and Netta, thank you. That ends our broadcast here at I24 News Morning Edition. This was, of course, a special broadcast. We will be updating you throughout the weekend on more from Operation Protective Edge. As we said, 2 rockets have been fired over the southern region of Israel this morning after a relatively quiet night. We will be having more headlines in just a moment.